We're joined today, and Anne, forgive me, by a person I consider to be not just a great historian, but probably one of the most important journalists working today. And normally I urge people to buy their books because it's the nice and polite thing to do, given that you've made your time and you've probably done a couple of these conversations already today. Today I really urge you to go and buy Anne's book, because I think it speaks to a subject that we are at risk of neglecting and missing, and it's going to creep up on all of us and the way in which we live. When we get done, and forgive me, I'm adopting the role of head of marketing here, but when we get done, Anne, there are going to be a bunch of books to buy here. Anne has kindly signed, do pick them up. And if we have a ranging conversation today and we don't touch on all the points in the book, I'll consider that's a good thing, because what I really want to do is come away from this conversation thinking, I must read this book, because as far as I'm concerned, you must read this book.
Rather than, that was a very interesting conversation, I've heard everything that I need to know.
Now I don't.
And I don't have to buy the book now.
Exactly. Now we'll talk about everything else. So they go, well, what is that book about? Maybe I should read it. Anne Applebaum, as people will know, some of you will have read her history, The Gulag, an extraordinary piece of research and work. Some people will have read her writing at The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. And I should say one thing, Anne, before we get stuck into this. It's my mum's 80th birthday today, so I went to a lunch for her birthday. We had a party, and someone said to me, what are you doing this evening? I said, I'm talking to Anne Applebaum about Autocracy Inc. They said, oh, what's that about? I described the book. And they said, oh, my God, that's going to be depressing. And I said, actually, the weird thing about it is that when you get to the end of it, having been, you know, chilled and finding the future, in fact, the present, very fearful, it's incredibly invigorating. It's incredibly invigorating to think there are things that we can do. So I hope in the course of this conversation we'll get to those too. Can we start, if we might, in a pub in Bramley in Hampshire? Because you go to, I can't remember what the pub's called, but you go to a pub
that it's called either.
So it turns out, because one of the elements of Autocracy Inc. is money, and the way money works. So tell us what you discovered in a pub in Bramley in Hampshire.
Well, this was some years ago, so the precise details are now maybe a little foggy, but I did go visit some friends who live in Bramley, Hampshire. And they said, oh, it's so interesting. We have the local large house. I mean, it wasn't a famous house or sort of a grand house, has just been purchased by the mayor of Moscow. And I said, that's a very strange place for the mayor of Moscow to buy a house. And they knew it was the mayor of Moscow because he'd been seen at the pub. This is, you know, and he's a recognizable person. He was the former mayor. He's not the mayor anymore. And I thought, that's very extraordinary. I mean, but let's look it up. And so I tried to find in the records of the sale and so on. I looked around who had bought the house, and of course the mayor of Moscow's name is nowhere on it. And it was another name. Actually, I'm now forgetting what it was. But
Sunlight or
Sunlight or
Sky Mist.
Sunshine or Sky Mist. That's
yes.
Right. Skyfall, right?
Yeah. something Bondy.
Like some kind of Bondy name. And you know, but as I said, I knew who'd bought it because my friends lived there and they had noticed. Yuri Lushkin, he was called. And Lushkov, and then I wrote something about it in which I casually mentioned this, and then of course I got a kind of letter from the mayor's lawyer saying this is an outrageous thing. He has not bought this house. His wife has bought it. So okay. But the point was that it's possible to buy a very large piece of property in the middle of a town in rural England. Under a hidden name. You can disguise who you are. You can unless you hang around the pub as he did, you can go completely undetected. And of course, as we know, I'm sure we're in the middle of central London. There's quite a lot of property around here that's owned by anonymous companies. And at least until very recently, we were just discussing the ways in which this might or might not be changing, it was possible to buy property in London completely anonymously to hide your identity. And sometimes it would be hidden behind several things. So Sky Mist Holdings would be owned by Skyfall Holdings, which would be owned by Spectre Holdings, and you would have no way, and there would be legally no way to trace who it was, and it wasn't possible to find that out. And so, why would you want to buy property anonymously? Well, you might want to do it if you'd stolen the money. You might want to do it if you were hiding the money from somebody, from the tax authorities, or from your wife, or you might want to do it because you're a public figure or a politician who's not supposed to have that much money, and you have it for, we don't know why you have it, but you do. But the effect of it is that people over the last couple of decades began to use, this is not only a London problem, although it's somehow very notable in London, people began to use the London property market the way old-fashioned Swiss bank accounts used to be used. So you would use a flat in London as a way to store money secretly. And it would be, and maybe you would use it, or maybe you wouldn't, or maybe your daughter would use it while she was attending the LSE under a fake name or whatever. But maybe it was just a way to keep some money that you didn't want to have detected. And so, but the question is, and people, I should say, this was legal. I'm not accusing anybody of illegality. It was legal, but the question is, why was it legal? In whose interest was that? Why is it good that people saw the London property market as a place to hide stolen money and not as a place to live? How much did that distort the London property market? Why is it that central London property became totally unaffordable for most people?
Just join the dots with you, because I suppose when I read your piece in the FT, when I read the start of the book, I was surprised that you kicked off with kleptocracy, given that there seems to be so much around autocracy that is about hard power, that's about technology. What's the link between the money laundering, the secrecy, the lack of transparency, and your view on the threat to democracy?
So, all those things, lack of transparency, secrecy, opacity around how people have money and why, these are traits of autocratic systems. This is one of the things that is notable about modern autocratic states. And the degree to which those practices have become normal here, or in America, or in a lot of modern democracies, is a sign of the deterioration of our own political systems, or our own democracies, rather. That's the better word. Because in a healthy democracy, you know who owns what, and you know why. And actually, I mean, in a healthy property market, people buy houses to live in them and not to store stolen money. To me, I mean, first of all, in part, it's also that the story of how a lot of modern kleptocracies came to be involves us. We contributed to it. It was Western financial systems and banks and lawyers and accountants who enabled the rise of, certainly that's true in the case of Russia, but I think almost in many other countries as well. And then because that's had an effect on us. And there are a lot of things that we have, as I said, we came to accept it as normal. I mean, that property could be purchased anonymously. Why is that normal? Why these are, people often treat, I mean, even for example, offshore tax havens. People treat them like they're natural landmarks, like it's a coral reef or a volcano. It's just there. It's not just there. It's created by a set of laws. There's a legal system that creates them and allows people to use them, and we could uncreate it. I mean, they don't have to be there. We could remove them if we wanted to. And anyway,
so let's come to that in a bit, because I think I was saying to Anne before we got started, I was saying one of the invigorating things about reading your piece in the FT was reading a piece that was pointing out things in the pages of the FT that are about the readers of the FT.
That's why I did it.
So why don't we not tiptoe around it? Why don't we get to it right now? What is your view of the enablers, and how do you deal with that problem?
You make what they do illegal. I mean, but when we call them enablers, I mean, I feel we're not talking about people who are breaking the law. You know, we're talking about people who are doing things that are legal. But if we change the rules, then they'll stop doing it. I mean, if it's illegal to sell property to somebody who's buying it with stolen money, and if you, as the real estate agent, are legally responsible for making sure that your client isn't laundering money, then people will begin to behave differently. I mean, we can change that behavior. I mean, and it's a very weird thing because I know the system in America better than I know it here. But you know, if you were to, if somebody is to open a bank account in the United States, you have to produce documents. You have to produce a passport, and you have to, you have to say who you are. And if you invest money in a company, or you buy a company, you have to show where your money is from. I mean, there are a lot of American businesses regulated to death. I mean, if you run a pension fund or something like that, you're constantly filling out forms and proving things and showing that you're following the law. And yet, at the same time, there are these parallel parts of the economy where you don't have to show anything at all, and so that you can open a company. You can found a company and not show a document, and that's extraordinary.
So let's just go through what you would do in order to prevent the kinds of things that we see every day in London, either ownership of property and you can't identify who the true owner is, operations of trusts where you can't see who the beneficial owner is. And, in the book you point out the IPOs of companies like Rosneft, where the ultimate beneficiaries are part of Vladimir Putin's circle. What would you say needs to happen for those things to stop happening?
Well, I mean, some of them are easy. I mean, you make it, you can't buy a piece of property anonymously. You have to give your real name. You have to produce an ID card or, I don't know, passport, and say who you are. That doesn't seem to be very hard to fix at all. There are other, I once had this other scheme, which is probably undoable, which was my idea, was that you could require everyone who owns residential property in Britain to pay taxes in Britain on their worldwide income.
Yeah. And
then you would have a, sea change in who buys property and why. I mean, I'm not. There might be adverse consequences, but I mean, we don't think very creatively about any of this. About any of this. And my suggestion was, why not?
Can I just ask you about that, the personal thing? And I'm going to bring the lights up in a moment because people are going to want to weigh in and have things to say too. But can I ask you a personal thing about this? The really interesting thing about this book I found, by comparison, for example, with the history with Gulag, for example, is it's a piece of reporting and it's an argument. And it leads you to a place, as you say, which is a campaign for certain changes. How does that feel?
Oh, that's what my journalism is a lot. I mean, I write reported arguments, so that's sort of what I do.
The reported arguments bit I get, and what I'm asking really about is once you've got to that conclusion, the campaign, the making the change happen.
So I'm not in a position to run and organize the campaign, but I would be very keen for other people to do it, and I would like to encourage them and to do it.
No, that's fair enough.
And I do spend a lot of time talking to people who run campaigns and who both inside autocracies and elsewhere, and to people who think about this stuff and how to change it.
So let's move on from the so the book, if you like, some people have read the book, but the book deals with, I think, kind of three really big, broad elements of modern autocracy: the extent to which it's moneyed, the extent to which it's on offense, and the extent to which it's coordinated, particularly in technology terms. The offense nature of it, the idea that it's out to actually undermine perceptions of democracy and liberal values in Western societies, is that something that you think is coordinated between autocrats, or it's just instinctive given their needs to survive?
So the book is an argument that it's not coordinated. There is a network but the network is not joined up ideologically. So you have communist China, you have nationalist Russia, you have theocratic Iran, you have Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, you have whatever North Korea is. You have a group of states that share certain things, but they don't have as common vision of the world, and they don't have common goals. They don't have the same aesthetics, and so on. They're, some of them are one-man rulers, and some are run by parties, and so on. So they're not the same, but they do collaborate opportunistically when it suits them. Sometimes for financial reasons, sometimes in the interests of staying in power or keeping power, and sometimes in the interest of undermining us. I mean, all of them are states which, where the ruling party or the leader seeks to rule without checks and balances. They don't want to have be bothered by independent courts or media or any kind of transparency. They aren't states where the rule of law holds. It's rule by law, meaning the ruler decides what the law is. They aren't states where people have rights, and they aren't states that respect anything that would look like human rights or universal rights. And so their fight is very often against the people who use that language. And some of those people are their own dissidents or their own democracy activists inside their countries. I mean, whether it's the Hong Kong democracy movement or the really amazingly well-organized and talented Venezuelan opposition, or whether it's the Iranian women's movement, those are their opponents. But of course, we use that language too. And part of the fight against their opponents is now also undermining us and attacking the positive narrative and image of democracy as well.
And we've touched, if you like, on the sort of financial craven forces that might have enabled that kleptocracy, particularly in capital centres like London or New York. But ideologically, one of the things you touch on in the book is the optimism. I think I was in a room when Bill Clinton gave the speech in China that you described, where
you were in that room.
Yeah, where they talked about, hey, listen, you try holding back the internet. Good luck. It's like nailing Jello.
He said it was like nailing Jello to the wall.
Nailing Jello to the wall, and we all laughed.
At Johns Hopkins,
yeah, we all laughed, and we thought, yeah, you're right. This thing's going to change everything. It didn't. In fact, control of the internet, control of technology proved to be much more powerful and available than we thought. So what is the governing thinking now around globalization, trade, the making available technologies and exchange? What do you think is the right way of approaching that?
First of all, it's important, the globalization turned out not to be the one-way street that we imagined. We imagined that somehow, as we used to say, that democracy and democratic ideals or ideas would flow from west to east. And instead it turned out that also authoritarianism, so to speak, I don't know about this east and west anymore, but I mean, would move in the other direction. Once, for example, you had a global political conversation, then it was, why shouldn't the Russians intervene and enter into the conversation and join it? I mean, they'd been trying to do that when they were the Soviet Union in the past, much less successfully and with much more effort. And I think we assumed that these changes, like all technological changes, would be somehow good for us. But of course, technology is neutral. There's nothing good or bad about technology. It's a question of how it's used and how it's deployed. And the Chinese saw the internet coming. This is like back in the 1990s. They guessed at what it could do, and they sought to control it from the beginning. So from the beginning, they used it as a way of supporting their system, and they turned it into a system of surveillance and kind of control of conversation. I don't know, we didn't have the imagination to see that that was possible.
So you describe in the book and in the journalism, quite a lot of the journalism you've written, that Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, if you like, the first real occasion that we've seen Autocracy Inc. in a kinetic way challenging democracy and the legal principles that underpin it.
Yes.
So just explain that.
So the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin had several motivations. Some were he has a grandiose vision of himself as the leader of a new empire. So it's a very classic imperial war, colonial war. At the same time, it had another purpose. Putin was saying with that invasion, and it continues to this day. I mean, with the bombing of hospitals and residential apartment buildings yesterday and today. He's saying, I don't care about your rules. I don't care that you think in post-war Europe we don't change borders by force. I don't care about the Geneva Conventions on warfare. I don't care about this slogan, never again. This is this mantra that people said after the Holocaust, that we will never let this happen again. I'm going to build concentration camps in occupied Ukraine, which he has done. And I'm going to kidnap children in occupied Ukraine, and I'm going to deport them to Russia and change their names. And I'm going to treat people however I want to treat them, and I'm going to torture Ukrainians, at random or murder them as they did in Bucha. And he continues almost every day to show that I'm doing this because I don't believe in these rules or these norms or whatever you call them. And some of them, by the way, are nothing to do with the so-called West. I mean, this is just language written in the UN Charter, which is something that was accepted by the Soviet Union and China and so on, decades and decades ago. But they have decided that the language of rights, the language of human dignity, all the language that's written into international institutions, they want it gone. He wants to show that he can behave abroad, around the world, exactly the way he behaves at home, with no checks and balances, with no respect for the law. If he wants to arm mercenaries in Africa and send them in to help an African dictator stay in power, he'll do that. And if he wants to occupy and murder Ukrainians, he'll do that.
And what do you think the West response tells him about what we believe?
So he did not expect any Western response. I mean, he thought he would get to Kiev in 3 days, and then the plan was to conquer the rest of Ukraine in 6 weeks. So he was surprised that there was still the possibility of an organized response from the democratic world, which includes, by the way, more than 50 countries have contributed to the defense of Ukraine. So it's not just even America and Europe. It's Asian democracies, Australia, other so-called global South as well. So he was surprised by that. He didn't expect it. It's cost him far more in all kinds of ways than he thought it was. But it's also true that at the same time, we didn't anticipate the degree to which the autocratic world would help him. And so what have we seen? We've seen the Iranians sending drones, the Shahed drones, which the Russians used to attack Ukraine. The North Koreans sending ammunition. The Chinese have sold parts and components that have been useful to the Russian defense industry. So there is a kind of network around Putin and his war, and his war that have supported him as well. And we didn't anticipate that. And I also think we underestimated what it would take to. Well, we haven't. My current criticism, my argument was that we never decided to win the war. We did not decide to make sure that Ukraine won. And this I think is a real catastrophe.
So can we just talk about that though for a moment, because it seems, or it feels more and more as though what's being revealed about the West is that in one form or another we don't care enough. And that there is not a willingness to put significant resources and certainly lives at risk in defense of A, those people, or B, those principles. And do you think that's right, even if it pains you to admit it? Do you think that's right? And do you think that as a result of that, we head to a different world?
It's possible. I mean, I think in Ukraine there was actually there has been, mostly from Washington. I mean, I don't want to downplay what was done. I mean, actually, the galvanization of the democratic world was pretty remarkable, and their previous presidents wouldn't have done it. So the fact that Biden did that was remarkable and extraordinary, and the fact that Biden went to Ukraine in the middle of the war a couple of years ago. I mean, all those things I don't want to downplay them. It's just that we didn't quite ever get the decision that the Ukrainians should win. It's always been about the defense of Ukraine or the endurance for Ukraine. And I'm now at 2.5 years into the war, there's just a question whether Ukraine can stay together as a society, particularly after I'm not.
So where do you think this heads?
Either it heads towards a decision that we will let them, for example, begin striking Russian targets, which they've been asking to do for a year. The thing I'm worried about now is that we may get another wave of Ukrainian refugees this winter, because the Russians are targeting power plants and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. It might become impossible for many people to live in Ukraine. You can't live in a Ukrainian city in the winter if you have no heat and no water. And so that may be the next phase, unless we, I don't know, unless we begin. We didn't plan from the beginning to help them win.
And what would it need now to win?
I mean, what it would certainly need now would be to help the Ukrainians defend their cities. So I don't know, no-fly zone is now a kind of cliche that means different things to different people. But yeah, we need to help. We need to send in air defense right now. We would need to cover at least help them cover Western Ukraine. And we would need to let them begin striking the objects that are hitting them. Anyway, that's the beginning. Let me just say also, this is a war that will be over. It will be won when the Russians decide that they don't want to fight it anymore. And so when the Russians are at the point that the French were at, when the French ended their war in Algeria, it's a very interesting moment. They fought for 10 years, this Algerian war, and it was, bloody and damaging to France in a lot of ways as well. And then finally there was a moment when they didn't want to do it anymore. And that was actually a moment of great political turmoil in Paris. There was an attempted coup and someone tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle and so on. But they did end it, and they made a decision that Algeria is not France. We're not going to make it be part of France, and we're ending. And that's where the Russians are. And they can reach that conclusion for a lot of reasons and in a lot of ways. They can reach it for military reasons. And they can also reach it for economic reasons or political reasons. I mean, so another piece we haven't discussed yet, and this is maybe more in the weeds than you want to go, but we also haven't really tried to, use sanctions in a way that it makes the Russian defense industry impossible to produce new things. And we could be trying harder to do that. There's a whole technical argument. We're not really thinking about this as an economic war in which we need to shut this down, and we haven't done that yet either.
But Sam, will you just bring the lights up so people who want to weigh in can just catch my eye? And I will do that. I'm going to come. Paul, I'll come to you in 1 second. But can we just finish up just one final point on Ukraine? There are people who say we've always done things too little, too late. There was the convoy. You could have attacked the convoy. There was a call for air defences. Those could have been put in much sooner. Then there were called for actually strikes onto those Russian positions earlier. Every time, the fear has been that Russian retaliation, the risk of Russian retaliation was too great. Do you think that Putin has read the West right and the West has read Putin wrong? That actually the West is willing to compromise on those principles, and Putin is not too much of a retaliation threat?
So, first, I mean, this is maybe more farther in the direction of Ukraine and Putin than you want to go, but it's become pretty clear. I mean, all the things that were supposed to be red lines that were going to provoke Putin, hitting targets in Moscow, hitting the Russian oil refineries, which the Ukrainians do with drones, capturing Russian territory. The Ukrainians are now occupying a part of Russia. The first time this is the Second World War that Russia has been invaded. All those things were supposed to be unthinkable, and how could you do that? There would be some horrible, and actually there's not.
Yeah. And
so almost every time there's been a supposed red line, they've crossed it. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that the Russians don't want to use nuclear weapons. The Chinese have made publicly and probably off the record clear that they don't want them to do that. The Chinese are now in a dominant position in that relationship. Also, this is more technical, but it's very hard to see how they could use nuclear weapons on the battlefield. There was a lot of conversation about tactical weapons, but they would hit their own troops, and winds blow east, and it's not easy to see what they could do. I mean, I can't exclude the idea that Putin would finally do something suicidal, but nobody really thinks he's suicidal at the moment.
No.
He's not crazy, you know.
So all that should lead you to the view that it's more winnable than perhaps we thought in the spring of 2022.
We just haven't wanted to win it. Anyway, that's a...
Well, let's get people to weigh in. Will you just say your name and then have a point of view? We have a sort of loose rule, no questions. We want to hear what your point of view and want Anne to engage with your points of view, but it's not...
I'd love to not have to answer questions.
It's not fiercely enforced. Paul, then we'll come to a gentleman here, and you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Paul Atherton. What I'm most interested in, when we began this conversation, there was this sort of notion of optimism around what local societies could do in respect to these things. Now, as a social campaigner here in Britain and looking at sort of British issues, one of the big problems I see is being able to communicate to masses through media that doesn't necessarily want to take that communication. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious through your research, this is a question, through your research, whether or not there is a means to communicate to those people that have the influence to sort of change the laws, say in respect to where the finance is coming from, especially as Britain created most of these sort of bog holes for tax purposes.
I mean, there are people who campaign for them. I mean, there is Transparency International, and there are several other groups who do study that and campaign around it. I mean, what I would think would be interesting to do is not so much try to influence, I don't know, the London bankers, but start to connect the dots for people. You know, the one really successful opposition campaign that worked in Russia was Alexei Navalny's campaign. And that was actually not a human rights democracy campaign. That was an anti-corruption campaign. Mm. And what he did was he would make these films. The most famous one was about a palace that Putin built and the financing of it and so on. It doesn't matter. But he made the connection between that palace and the way ordinary Russians lived. You know, you don't have, you know, paved roads and you have bad health care because he has the palace. And that's not exactly the same situation here, but, you know, why is London property so expensive? You know, why are these weird distortions in the British economy? It's because of this stuff. And I'd like to see more people make those connections. I mean, there's some other connections to be made as well. I mean, I've always felt that the people who care about autocracy and dictatorship and the people who care about climate change have more in common than they think, because many of these states are petro states. You know, many of the Russia is a state that survives on is a fossil fuel producer. That's how that's a lot for a lot of reasons that I'm sure you know, that fossil fuel states with natural resources often tend towards autocracy because someone controls that enormous resource, and it's likely to be a small group of people and so on. I mean, then there's a big exception, which is Norway. But the Norwegians found their oil after they already had a democracy. So it's, you know.
Just out of interest, actually, my colleague Paul Caruana-Galizia is here, and he did a whole bunch of work years ago on Greg Barker and Rusal and the Russian the move of Russian energy assets and energy businesses here. Can I tell you one thing?
He also wrote a great book. Is he here?
He wrote a great book. There's Paul, yeah. He did write a great book. He wrote a great book. But can I ask one thing? In your book, you point out the Yukos story. Mm-hmm. Mikhail Khodorkovsky builds, in whatever fashion he built it, this enormous energy business. Yukos, it essentially gets requisitioned by the Russian state. At the end, gets bundled into Rosneft. Rosneft eventually lists on the London Stock Exchange. I think its chief executive is Putin's deputy chief of staff.
At the time, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Rosneft lists on the London Stock Exchange. Every big-name bank is involved in the IPO, all the big city law firms. Are you saying, Anne, that we don't want a world in which Rosneft lists on the London Stock Exchange?
We don't. I mean, why is it legal for a company that's built on stolen assets to be listed on the London Stock Exchange?
And so you don't buy the argument, which was the argument that I grew up with. I grew up at the FT as a journalist, and we operated what we thought of as the Wimbledon principle. which is we didn't mind where people came from, but if they obeyed, because England had no good tennis players, obviously, so we wanted to get all the good ones. But if you came here and you observed the rules of tennis, that was a good thing. And the argument of the London Stock Exchange historically was, by bringing companies like that to the UK, they had to observe rules of transparency and disclosure that were a good thing. Your view is, actually, no, we don't want companies like that.
But, you know, I'm sure it's good for them to, but how much disclosure is disclosure? I mean...
True.
I don't know. I mean, the Rosneft sale was a long time ago now. But... you know, how much are they required to show where the assets of the company came from? I mean, shouldn't we need to know that, and shouldn't we, if they were illegally obtained, shouldn't that be disqualifying?
Yeah. So, did you say your name? Yes. You, the gentleman right in the front. Yes. Hello. Hi there. Thank you.
Going back a little bit to the Russian story, so I specialise in demographics. And there was a wonderful guy, writer in the early 70s, who wrote a book called The Fall of the Soviet Union, and he used demographic data to show that the Soviet Union was fundamentally rotten to its core. You know, very high suicide rates, plunging, or very high infant mortality rates. And he sort of, 20 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, he predicted it pretty accurately. Now, of course, you know, a broken clock is still right twice a day. Looking at Russian demographics now, they are some of the worst you've ever seen. They're appalling. And this is before the war. So a 15-year-old boy in Russia has a higher chance of reaching age 60 if he moved to Iraq.
Wow.
And that was before. So I suppose, looking at it, I see Russia as a country where we have an elite at the top that's stolen all the wealth, that delivers very little for the people. You look at the opinion polls coming out of Russia, increasingly people are now saying in Russia, we wouldn't mind a ceasefire, you know, we wouldn't mind some sort of compromise, which in Russia is probably as close as you're going to get to saying we don't agree with the war anymore. I suppose I'm interested in the idea that Russia can both be a great threat to us, but also can be incredibly weak at the same time. These two things exist at the same time.
I don't think that's terribly contradictory. I mean, you know, in some senses, you know, because it's partly because of the failure of Putin's economic promise to Russia. So he essentially, I mean, it wasn't said exactly like this, but a couple of decades ago, the idea was, okay, I'm corrupt and I've stolen a lot of stuff, but at least living standards are going up in Russia and everybody's pension is paid on time. And that was sort of the deal. And when that began to collapse, mostly originally because of falling oil prices, he needed a different narrative to give people. And then he came up with, not very originally, with this narrative of nationalism. You know, I'm going to make us great, and we're going to matter on the world stage, and maybe you're going to be poor and downbeaten, but at least, you know, we're going to challenge the United States. And you know, so often you know, it's not really about how wealthy a country is; it's about how venal I mean, how focused their aggression is. And, you know, the Russians may not be certainly they're not as wealthy as China, but the Chinese are not as focused as the Russians are on undermining us. I mean, there are people in Moscow who wake up every morning thinking, you know, how do we screw the Americans, or how do we break up the European Union? That's their job, right? Yeah. And so if you put enough resources into that, you get some impact. Whereas, as I said, I mean, there are also a lot of other awful dictatorships on the planet who don't spend their time thinking about it. I don't think, do most people in Vietnam wake up in the morning and think, how do we break up the European Union? I don't think so. You know, on the contrary, actually, the Vietnamese are very weirdly pro-American, and they want to trade, and they're a country that does not want to. Not involved in our politics at all. So when we talk about Russia and China and Iran and the kind of group of other dictatorships who think weaker ones who think the same way, I mean they pose a very specific kind of problem.
There's someone just at the back. Phoebe, actually, two people next to each other back. Can we take you? One's right at the back. Thank you. And I'll come to you soon in a sec. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Phoebe.
Hi, Anne. Thank you. My name is Bex. So I'm going to try and frame this as a comment, but it will probably end up as a question. I guess I'm really struck by the thought that we're having a conversation about autocracy and democracy. But the very specific premise of our democracy is entirely bundled up with capitalism. And
I didn't hear that.
It's entirely wrapped up with capitalism.
Wrapped up with.
Right, and this sort of premise of free markets and prosperity and growth and all of these ideas that we sort of hoped to export to the world. And I guess I'm interested in these questions you ask around why. Why is it the UK? Why is it the US? Which are absolutely the most sort of rampant form of that sort of free market capitalism that actually become the enablers of kleptocracy and autocracy. And I guess it's an interesting point to kind of consider, which is, does democracy really survive this particular brand of capitalism that we have? And are there other models which are more socialist, more European, which actually are much more effective at countering some of these kleptocratic tendencies? Because actually what our form of capitalism enables is such a profound ability to pursue interests, invested interests, which are not really met particularly well by process. So I guess I wonder how much that's informed your thinking, sort of capitalism as a specific part of democracy. And also forgive me because I haven't yet read your book, but I absolutely will be doing so.
Very good, Bex. Will you before you answer, Anne, there's a gentleman just next to you.
Yes, a slightly different point, but I'm half Russian.
So what's your name?
No, Christian.
Christian.
I'm half Russian. My father is Russian, and he told me a lot of stories about Russia in pre-Tsar days. Even he was very old when I was born, and it's very clear that Russia has never been kind of well ruled. Really, there were the old Tsar that was kind of okay, but it's always been an autocracy of one sort or another. And I slightly disagree with your thesis in your book that you said that Russia never was going to kind of become good after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was doomed to kind of.
I didn't say that.
Didn't you say that? I thought you implied that in a previous talk I went to. But do you think there's any hope for Russia to not be an autocracy? I mean, I'm sorry that's a question, but it's...
No, far away. No, that's good. Christian, thank you.
So those are confusingly different questions.
So, but do you want to deal with... But Bex's point, actually, I think is a really interesting one. If you have a capitalism that is really focused and prioritises financial return, does that enable all of the secrecy and confidentiality and anonymity?
I was thinking about, so are there nice European social democracies where capitalism works better? I mean, I was thinking about Switzerland. Switzerland has a brilliant democracy. Actually, it's one of the most. The more you learn about it, the more fascinating it is. I mean, they use referenda a lot, but it's also very, very local. There are actually towns in Switzerland where they vote for things by everybody coming into the town square, which is it's like Greek.
Athenian,
Greek. I mean, ancient Greek, and yet Switzerland was also a society that, a little bit less now actually, but which enabled for a long time, money laundering. I mean, the classic thing was the Swiss bank account, which was an anonymous bank account where you could keep money and nobody would know who it was. They supported this secrecy. So it's not so much, the problem isn't so much capitalism, which is a very broad term that means a lot of things to different people. It's how you regulate it and what you what values you put into it. I mean, this is slightly, this may be a way to combine the two questions. I mean, another one of my objections in the way people talk about Russia and the Russian transition in the 1990s is people talked about it as a transition to capitalism. It wasn't really. I mean, there was never a moment when you had rule of law and when people with really good ideas, could invest in things and build up their companies and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and compete, in a fair market. And that never happened. There wasn't a moment like that. Instead, from the very beginning, the market was dominated by people who had essentially taken over or got access to state resources, and some people had access and others didn't. That's a very, again, I'm simplifying to tell a complicated story, but what rules you put into the system and what you allow and don't allow, change the way your system works. And I just think that we possibly for the Wimbledon rule that you said. I mean, we had this illusion that, you know, our system was so strong that anybody could come and play around in it, and it wasn't ever going to affect us.
Yeah.
And it didn't really matter what happened over there in Russia because it was so far away. And anyway, they're so weak now, they can never affect us, and they don't matter anymore. And we're really interested in other things now. And that was the mistake. You know, what we did was enabled the growth of what's now a real security threat to us and to other Europeans. And it was a mistake. I mean, well, we can, you know, now it's time to backtrack and change it. And I want to say actually about Russia, you know, your question, the way it went was interesting because usually what people say is, oh, Russia's always been a dictatorship and it always will, and there's something culturally about Russia. It's actually, there was, if you were in Russia in the 90s, which I was, there was a moment when a lot of people wanted Russia to be different. And there were a lot of people who also believed that by integrating their economy with ours, that they would open up and they would become more liberal or they would become more democratic. And actually, for a while, it was true, you know, so Russia of the 90s was completely different from Russia of the 80s, and there was this open conversation and so on, and it felt for a long time like that might still be possible. And you know, but the truth is that the Russian state was taken over and captured by this little group of KGB officers, eventually led by Putin. And they made decisions. They pushed it in the other direction. So I mean, leadership is very important, and they had a set of leaders who were nostalgic for the Soviet past, as it turned out in the end, and who structured the system to benefit themselves financially and in terms of power. But I don't think it was inevitable at all.
No, it wasn't inevitable, but can I just jump on that? Because at the end of your book, Anne, you say, look, the idea of the liberal world order is over. It doesn't exist in the way it did. And I was just thinking, I think you grew up as a journalist at The Economist. I grew up as a reporter.
Yeah, very briefly at The Economist.
FT, but now The Atlantic and The Washington Post. You know, we basically knocked around newsrooms which have quite a similar worldview, and certainly through the 90s and the first decade or so of this century, pro-globalization, believing that, you know, a good financial tide will lift all boats, excited by technology and the democratizing power of technology. And if you look...
Well, because partly that was our experience. That's what had happened hitherto.
And all of those things have been, if you like, the drivers and the enablers of Autocracy Inc.
In the past decade, yes. Mm-hmm.
And so what do you now think is the right approach to integrating autocracies into world trading systems, providing technology, financial markets?
So I don't want to. One of the points in my book is that I don't want to. It's not a new Cold War, and I don't want to isolate parts of the world. I mean, any more than we have to. And obviously, we're not going to cut off trade with China tomorrow and do lots of economic damage to people unnecessarily. It's just that, you know, the Chinese think strategically about trade. You know, they think about, I don't know, buying ports, you know, and how those could be used. You know, they think about investing in, you know, there was the Huawei controversy. You know, they think about how their telecoms companies can be used to, you know, collect information here. TikTok, you know, is, I don't know, among other things, it may well be a Chinese information gathering operation. Mm-hmm. You know, they think about those things, and we don't. You know, we kind of pretend that it's all neutral and it doesn't really matter, and we're just trading widgets and there's no impact. And I just think it's time for us to think more strategically. Are these investments that we want, are they good for us?
Yeah.
Are the investments that we're making good for us? And think about it more carefully.
There's a gentleman here. I'm sorry, David here. Do you want to pass the mic? And then this gentleman here. Oh, 1 second. Yeah.
David Gorget. Someone said, and I didn't really know how to answer this, what could the West have done better? And this is sort of a common argument from some people who are pro-Putin, and I don't really know how to answer it completely, but maybe you can. I mean, people say, well, the Berlin Wall fell, and then a lot of Western money flowed in, but it flowed into the wrong people, and Moscow became gangster city based on Western money. And then the KGB officers said, well, we didn't like that, so we're going to take over. Someone also said, you know, Putin was actually trying to modernize Russia, And then what happened in 2014 is there was a violent overturning of an election in Ukraine, and the West went in flag waving. Somebody also said that Putin was extremely upset about Western double standards in Libya and Iraq. Could we have done things better? That's quite a rap sheet.
We are coming to...
We will finish on the dot at 7:30.
I don't know if you want to...
And we'll just take this one other point and then deal with those, and then you'll ask me to do the two.
Hello, Nacho Moraes. My thought is more that aren't we getting what we deserve as citizens, as institutions, and as a society? Like, for instance, we have a foreign office secretary that goes right out from a NATO summit to a party with the son of a KGB officer, allegedly with no security precinct, and when he comes back, instead of going to the basement of MI6, he goes to number 10. We make him prime minister. Like we have, like on the real estate, come on, they are participating actively in 2 of the 3 layers of money laundering that are layering and placement. The thing is that they require a source of funds, real estate agents. A guy from a country that was, until 4 days ago, or well, 4 days now, but until a few years ago, a communist republic, appears flashing money like the Duke of Westminster. And just one last point, very briefly. The economists have come up that should be like the gold standard in certain. And the thing is that I read on Sunday, the elections in Germany puts Germany in uncharted territory.
Yeah.
The thing is that don't we have memory? Don't we have willing to fight?
So, Nacho, thank you. Forgive me, we're going to ask Anne, I'm going to ask you to address both of these things. Because in so many ways they're a similar question. Could the West have done something differently? And do we have fundamental problems that sit within our own democracy and that are not just being, exacerbated or caused by autocracies?
I mean, so there's a very long conversation to be had about going back to the 1990s and Western policy towards Russia. But just do remember that it was early in the 90s that the Baltic states, and famously there's a moment when the Prime Minister of Estonia began to warn the West about the imperialism of Russia, the continuing effort, the continuing aggression towards neighbors. There was an attempt to destabilize Estonia. This is the famous Bronze Soldier event. I think it's 2006 or 7. Yeah. There's the invasion of Georgia in 2008. There's a series of events. There's actually the Transnistria, which is much earlier than that. The idea that Russia would be a destabilizing force in its neighborhood isn't something that we made up or we forced Russia to do. I mean, you can go back 20, 30 years and you can find them beginning with that. And so when you talk about mistakes that we make, I mean, I would argue that we didn't recognize those things for what they were early enough. I would also argue that we didn't. Our mistake was in laundering the money of Russia's leaders. Russia was invited to join, fora after fora, the G7 and various other different kinds of councils, and there was a NATO-Russia. There was a kind of special NATO-Russia organization that was designed to iron out problems. There was the OSCE, and Russia, repeatedly refused to participate in these organizations, refused to follow the rules. Would eventually say we are an imperial country and we can do whatever we want. I don't want to go down that road because it's a very. It's a long story.
So, Anne, let me make sure that we respect time and that we end on time. And we're going to have to come back, naturally, at a future time. And Peter, forgive me, to kind of questions about what sits within our democracy. But I want to ask you one final question.
By the way, I wrote another book about that.
Which one are we talking about?
It's called Twilight of Democracy.
Oh, yeah, Twilight of Democracy. Yes.
That was more about us. This is more about them. But it's a But if you want my answer to that question, read my...
Twilight in Democracy, excellent. I'm not the only one who's in marketing. Anne, I've got one final question for you. This book is dedicated, at the very front first page of the book, it's for the optimists. Are you one?
I am, because the bravest people that I know are all optimists. Because the people that I really admire, you know, the people who've been activists in Russia, in China, in Iran, in Venezuela, because they've dedicated their time to be active and to try and change the most difficult societies in the world. And if they can do that, you know, who am I in sitting here in central London to say everything's terrible? So I believe that change is possible.
Out of their admiration, but just forgive me, this is a slightly personal note on which to end. With the death of Alexei Navalny, whom you knew, of course, did that change your view on the prospects for optimists?
No. I mean, there will be other people. I mean, it was a terrible blow to the people around him and to. But there will be another generation of dissent. You know, there will always be. You know, one of the features, if you will, of the autocratic world is that it produces its own dissent. You don't need America to do democracy promotion. You don't need evangelists talking about John Stuart Mill in Iran, because people find it themselves. You know, anybody who lives in a dictatorship of a truly harsh dictatorship works out that it's unjust. Or some people work out that it's unjust, and some people will always want to change it. And so, you know, the book is really dedicated to them.
Ladies and gentlemen, Anne Applebaum.